Let me start this by saying alone time inherently isn't a bad thing. And, it's healthy to spend time alone and to spend time reflecting. And maybe if we lose ourselves in the heat of socializing and the sort of norms of everyday life, it can feel good to ground ourselves back and sort of find ourselves in that alone time. But I do think it is a slippery slope, especially for those who would consider themselves sort of hyper self aware and hyper vigilant when it comes to self analysis and always investigating why it is they do things. And the reason is because your observations will turn into fixations, your anxieties will turn into crises. And what I mean by that is, given enough rumination, any little thing can become a big thing. So we have to be we have to be very careful to notice the importance of that said rumination. If there's nothing to distract ourselves with, those things that have kind of been not hiding under the surface, but rather lingering among the surface will start to come about. And if we don't treat them in a very precise and strict manner, they can start to wreak havoc emotionally. And it can really start to take a toll on us and dig us into a hole that we don't want to be in. And let's start with a very simple and rudimentary fact. Humans are social beings. We've spent much of our evolutionary history amongst small groups, and this is where I'm going to make the slight differential argument, and that is social media doesn't give us what real socialization would give us. Even though it itches that same scratch in our brain, it's too much. It's too, you know, stimulating, and our brain doesn't really know what to do with that much interpersonal information. So when I say alone time, there's a big difference in what I'm talking about, because in Eastern philosophy and spirituality, alone time is seen as something that is necessary to find ourselves. You know, the hero's journey where you go alone and you understand what you're about and all the shadows that have been lurking, and you really spend that time to understand who you are. But when social media and the internet comes into play, this goes out the window because you're not alone. You're not alone. You're observing and you're interacting with thousands of people on social media. And these aren't real interactions with real consequences in the way in which we act. And there's no cause and effect, really, that actually gives our brain any sort of psychoanalytical information that it can learn from. You can see this. People who spend too much time on social media, they start to lose their worldview. They think everything works how social media works. They think the world works how the internet works. And anyone who really is living in the world consistently can tell them that it doesn't work like that. Not everything is, you know, an Instagram post. Not everything is a TikTok video. And much of the boring, mundane things that people find joy in aren't documented on social media. But how does this play into isolation? And more importantly, how does this play into those who are hyper self aware? Many ways, many, many ways. And I'll give a very clear, easy to interpret example. For someone who is already self conscious, for someone who's already doubting themselves and feeling a lot of self inflicted anxiety and more so social anxiety, if you're watching people on social media who are, spending a lot of time on their appearance and who are all of the social engagements and interactions that they're going through are, I don't want to say scripted or rehearsed, but both parties or however many parties are aware that there's a camera involved and that the amount of money they make from monetizing that video is dependent on how entertaining and dramatic that video is. So imagine you watch 100, 200, 300, however many of these videos a day, and you don't have any social interactions. What does this tell your brain? This tells your brain that however you bring yourself into the world, you're going to be perceived in a dramatic and sort of extreme way. Because every time we see an interaction on the internet, it's some sort of extremity, it's some sort of crazy interaction that's happening. And our brain starts to think and it starts to send us these signals, anxious signals, that however we portray ourselves in life, in reality, people are going to react to us in some sort of extreme way, whether that be for good or for bad. And this plays into the fixations of the whole thing. Now all of a sudden we believe that we have to bring some sort of extravagant personality, some sort of outrageously, high standard of appearance into society to fit in. I don't know why I said society like that, but we'll move on. To fit in. When really that's not the case, and that most people, most authentic people who are living their day-to-day lives, who aren't completely consumed by social media, who aren't spending 97% of their time alone, they're not really thinking that deeply about things at all. And I don't mean thinking deeply in terms of understanding life's depth, but rather they're not analyzing every single person they meet. They're not holding everyone to this extreme standard of theatrics that social media portrays. So now that we got a pretty raw and easy to interpret example out of the way, let's go into what's happening inside of us. And let's go into why are we craving that isolation? A lot of times when I talk about this topic, I'll get a lot of comments that say, I'm frustrated and I'm sick of dealing with people. That's why I spend time in isolation. But you didn't choose isolation out of your free, open-minded, neutral state. You chose isolation because you're tired of people. What if you can have that same peace and comfort you have in isolation, but surrounded with the people that you enjoy spending time with? And then the answer usually turns into, if it's not sort of embedded with excuses, it will turn into, oh yeah, well, I would enjoy that. I would do that. So now we see a very clear picture. It's you didn't choose isolation off of your own accord. You chose isolation because you gave up. And I'm not saying that's wrong. And I'm not saying you are in any way, shape, or form, wrong for wanting to feel that peace. And I'm not saying people didn't disappoint you or do you wrong. But what I am saying is you gave up on interpersonal interactions and relationships as a result of a handful of interactions from a certain amount of people. So, and we see this theme in pretty much every single time someone self isolates for way too long. We see it with anxiety and fear much of the time. We say, why did you choose to spend so much time alone? And someone will say, I don't know. It's just socializing is so hard and things just don't really happen to be going my way and people don't like me and all these different belief systems that are portraying a narrative of, I didn't choose and I wouldn't choose to be alone. It's that I was given no other choice given the circumstances of my life. But that's not the full picture. The full picture is I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how to change the circumstances of my inner world. And so I retreat into isolation. That's the full picture. You retreated into isolation. You didn't choose isolation. You hibernated. You ran into isolation. And that's a big difference. And the point of this video and the reason I'm starting it in such a maybe brute manner, it's because there does need to be a wake-up call that happens. You know, isolation and the comfort that comes with spending a lot of time alone, we start to get into a very, very sticky place. Because if someone's in a dark place, but they're constantly surrounded by other people, this isn't the pure psychology answer, but they are distracted and they do have a little bit of time away from their thoughts. They do have a little bit of time from thinking about themselves. You can't think about yourself so much. You can't constantly be so hyper vigilant and constantly analyzing, oh, why do I feel this way? Why did I act that way? Why did I say that? You got to relax. You got to relax. You got to let those things go. It's not about solving all the whys and whats of who you are. It's about freeing yourself from that entire paradigm. You don't become the version of yourself that you're looking to become through constant self-analysis. You become that version by actually just letting go. Let go of all the mental games. Let go of all the theatrics, all the drama that's going on in your mind. Let go of all that. Be practical with yourself. I think when we spend a lot of time alone, we start to lose our footing. We lose a sense of balance and we keep, and I'm going to say this and I'm going to explain it, but we basically lose our head in the clouds. And that is now no thought system, no belief is off limits because there's nothing to challenge those things. I'm going to be honest, there's been times where I've gotten better advice from people who have practically no certification, practically no experience in psychology than those who are very well versed in the human mind. And that is because a lot of times the answer isn't more analysis. The answer isn't more digging to find out why and what and how and the reason you feel that way. There are times to discover that. But there also is that sort of rudimentary basic advice of you're thinking about it too much. You're spending too much time thinking about it. If you spend a lot of time alone, you need to make an effort to surround yourself with things that can occupy your mind with something other than self-analysis. That isn't the pretty explanation, that isn't the basic answer, but there was once an interview with this guy. He was an older gentleman, and I think the person interviewing asked him, you know, what would be your one advice to life? And the video went viral, so I guess I was expecting something relatively profound. And the guy simply said, keep yourself busy. And at first, this was at a place in my life and in my sort of mind experience where an answer like that was sort of not something I would approach with much positivity because at that time in my life, I was very, you know, investigate, observe, analyze, find out why it is you do this. Like, for what reason do I feel this way? Blah, blah, blah. And then he said, just keep yourself busy. Is this the complete answer? Is this going to be the answer in every situation? No, of course not. But for some of us who are extremely vigilant in constantly trying to analyze the very ways in which we operate and every little anxiety, every little fear we have, we're constantly asking why and what instead of just keeping ourselves busy enough to the point where we don't think about those things so much. How many of the problems in your life would still exist if you didn't think about them as much? It sounds so silly and simple, but a lot of times that's the exact thing we need. That's the exact thing we're missing. We can break down every one of your fears, every one of your anxieties, maybe where they stem from in your childhood. We can make parallels. We can draw lines to certain traumas and things like that. But if right now what you're struggling with is a feeling of being stuck, out of place, a bit of tension in the way that you're moving through life, you don't feel a sort of flow, you don't feel um, a sense of social adjustment in your life, alignment, then maybe the answer isn't more investigation. Maybe the answer is going and doing other stuff. Just go do something else. Go do something else. Spend less time alone. We think that every answer, whether it be psychologically or spiritually, we think everything is going to be very one dimensional. We think every advice is either right or wrong. But oftentimes, it's very case specific. And what I found in my life is that there will come points where we do have to self analyze and reflect and sit with ourselves and truly feel and all these different things. And trust me, there will be plenty of time for that. And if you're watching this video, you probably do a lot of that already. But equally so, and I say equally, very strongly, equally so, there are times where we need to go and live life. We need to go and live life. We need to go and talk to people. We need to go and experience different things. You can't just isolate. It doesn't do anything for you. Isolation, the peace you get from isolation is not sustainable. The confidence that you walk with when you're alone in your home is not sustainable. These feelings, these comforts and strengths that you cling to as a part of your character, they are relatively empty because they are untested. We don't want to hear the advice that we actually need. It's always like that. And the minute you can become your own brutal advisor, brutally honest advisor, is the minute that things can really change. Really change. Because when discomfort, and I know I bring up discomfort in almost every video, and it's the largest pillar that we have to overcome. Because for those who isolate for a long time, there's some sort of discomfort that you're avoiding. There is some sort of discomfort that you are avoiding feeling or facing. It's probably 9 out of 10 times, if not more. I'm only leaving the one because nothing can ever be so rudimentary, but there's always something that we're not willing to face. There's always a challenge that we're not willing to overcome in exchange for what we want. There's a concept that I've also said and that can either land smoothly or not so smoothly, and that is, are you allowing yourself to forget about all of your problems? And then maybe someone's immediate response would be, forget, like, I can't forget. These are things that I need to work on. These are things that I need to heal. And yeah, that might be true, but what is your definition of healing? Your definition of healing might be completely, I guess, disoriented with what you actually need out of your life. Healing doesn't mean taking a specific set of actions based on what you feel. Healing is trying and experiencing trial and error through different advices. So maybe you do have to forget about it. Maybe emotionally you have healed it, and maybe now you just have to forget about it. And I think a pretty decent sign that we have emotionally already kind of healed that wound and now we need to psychologically move on from it is if you find yourself distracted by other events, if you find yourself enjoying yourself, does the sort of hurting that precedes the wound, does it disappear? Does it sort of fade into the background? Do you not think about it anymore? And I think that's usually a pretty good sign. Because a lot of times emotionally, we store feelings in our body, and no matter what we do, it still sort of lingers. It still kind of hangs out there. But if you're hanging out with friends, if you're really engaged in something creative, and that sort of wound, or whatever you might want to call it, fades into the background, I think this is usually a sign that we're actually psychologically holding it onto it more than our nervous system is still holding on to it. Because sometimes there is nothing that we could do except regulate our emotions and give ourselves the proper time and healing techniques. But for many of you who probably clicked on this episode, that's not the case. The case is obsession. The case is rumination. And when will you come to a point where you realize that right now you have nothing to lose? Put yourself out there. Act like the main character if you must. Act like there's a documentary crew filming around, documenting your rise, your inner freedom, how you did it. Go flirt with life. Go dance. Don't care what anybody else says. These are things we need to do. We need to surrender into life. We need to experience life. We need to let go. We have to let go. And we have to ensure that this retreat, this hibernation that we've taken into isolation, that this isn't the final destination. All the peace that you feel, all the comfort that you feel when tucked away in your room with no one to bother you, with no stresses. This is meant to be a break. But when you treat the break like the final, you know, sort of place to be, you're going to start spiraling. Of course you are. There's too much room. There's too much nothingness going on. Even monks do activities. Even monks spend time together. We can't isolate. And I can't emphasize this enough. We can't isolate with only the internet as our sort of companion. It is so dangerous. Bare minimum. If you're going to isolate, read books, meditate, stay away from the screen a little bit, go on walks, go in nature. And even then, I do think this is only supposed to be a minority of the time. Much of the time, we're supposed to be engaged in whatever it is life is requiring from us, whether it be some sort of work, creative work, purposeful work, whatever it may be, socializing, engaging in relationships, whatever it may be. That stuff, the isolated stuff, the reading the books, the meditating, that's the private practice that you do for a small piece of the time so that you regroup and find yourself. And those practices only come to fruition and their results are only revealed as a result of experiencing and engaging in life. You can't hide away from what is required of you. And if you do, things are going to start crumbling. Things are going to start falling apart. You have to be brave enough to go outside of your comfort zone, to face your fears. What is the alternative? We cannot hide away. We can't shun ourselves from the path that is required of us. If we do, things will get worse because we were not meant to hide away and constantly obsess over every little thing. Maybe you need right now a little bit less healing. Healing is always happening. When I say less healing, I mean the specific type of healing we're doing. Maybe you need a little bit less of that type of analytical healing and a little bit more of living. Just try it. See what happens. Maybe you do feel free. Maybe you do feel lighter. Maybe you feel more spiritual. That's it for today's episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to leave a link in the description if you guys want to buy my book. It dives into topics like these and much more. You can also find it on Amazon. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. As always, if you're listening on Spotify, thank you for listening, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.